There's a moment that changes everything in the mind of a person who has lost someone they believed would always be there. It is not the moment you walk away. It is not the moment you stop answering messages. It is not even the moment you close the door and decide that enough is enough. The most powerful moment comes later, when they finally understand something they spent months or even years refusing to accept. You are not coming back. And when that realization begins to settle in, something unexpected often happens. The person who once acted as if they could replace you instantly, the person who appeared unaffected by your pain, the person who seemed completely certain that you would eventually return, may begin responding in ways that reveal a much deeper internal struggle. Because losing access to someone is not the same as losing control over someone. For a person with strong narcissistic traits, the hardest part is not always the breakup itself. The hardest part is facing the reality that someone they once influenced, someone who constantly explained, forgave, supported, and tried to repair the relationship, has finally reached a place where their absence feels like freedom instead of punishment. That moment creates a psychological conflict. Because the story they told themselves was different. They believed you would miss them more than they missed you. They believed your love would overcome your disappointment. They believed that after enough time passed, you would remember the good moments, forget the painful ones, and eventually reopen the door. But when you do not return, when your silence continues, when your life begins moving forward without their presence, the reality becomes much harder to avoid. The person they thought they could always reach is no longer emotionally available. And that is when their behavior can begin to change. Not necessarily because they have suddenly understood everything, not necessarily because they have transformed overnight, but because something important has been taken away from them. Certainty. For a long time, they may have felt certain that they understood your role in their life. They knew you cared. They knew you would explain yourself. They knew you would try one more time. They knew you would search for answers, ask for closure, or hope for change. Your continued effort became something they expected. But when your effort disappears, the entire dynamic changes. The silence that follows your departure can become louder than any argument you ever had. Because arguments still create connection. Anger still creates emotional energy. Even disappointment proves that someone is still invested. But indifference is different. Indifference communicates something far more difficult to accept. I am no longer organizing my life around you. And for someone who depends heavily on external validation, admiration, attention, or emotional reactions from others, that shift can feel deeply threatening. This is why some people suddenly begin revisiting the past after someone leaves. They may replay old memories. They may remember moments they ignored before. They may look back at conversations and experiences through a different lens. But there is an important distinction here. Remembering you is not the same as understanding you. Missing your presence is not always the same as recognizing your value. Feeling the loss of access to someone is not always the same as taking responsibility for why that person left. This is where many people become confused. They wonder, if they miss me, why did they treat me that way? They wonder, if I mattered, why did they make me feel like I didn't? They wonder, if they finally realized what they lost, why didn't they change when I was still there? These questions are painful because they reveal one of the hardest truths about certain unhealthy relationship patterns. Sometimes people only recognize the importance of something after they can no longer control or access it. When you were present, your love may have felt guaranteed. When you were available, your patience may have been taken for granted. When you were trying to repair the relationship, they may have focused more on defending themselves than understanding your pain. But when you truly leave, the situation changes. Now they are no longer responding to your requests. They are responding to your absence. And absence has a unique psychological power. It removes the distractions. It removes the constant emotional exchanges. It forces a person to confront the space where another person used to be. For some, that space creates reflection. For others, it creates a search for explanations that protect their self-image. Instead of asking, what did I do that caused this person to leave? They may ask, how can I explain this loss without seeing myself as responsible? And this is where the mind can begin creating different versions of reality. The relationship may be remembered differently. The breakup may be explained differently. The reasons you left may be interpreted differently. A person may convince themselves that you were impossible to satisfy, too demanding, too sensitive, or that the relationship failed because of circumstances rather than choices. This psychological process is not unique to one type of person. Many human beings struggle with accepting painful truths about themselves. The difference is that people with strong narcissistic defenses may rely more heavily on protecting their self-image because admitting fault feels deeply threatening to their identity. So instead of sitting with uncomfortable emotions like guilt, regret, or vulnerability, they may create a story that feels easier to survive. A story where they were always right. A story where they were the one who chose. A story where losing you was not a consequence of their behavior, but simply something that happened to them. But beneath that story is a reality they cannot completely erase. The reality that someone who once fought to be understood finally stopped fighting. The reality that someone who once waited for change finally chose peace. And that realization can create a reaction that many people never see coming, because when the narcissist understands you will never come back, they often do not simply move on. They begin trying to answer a question they avoided for a long time. How did I lose someone who was willing to give me so much? And the answer to that question is where the deepest psychological conflict begins. The moment someone realizes you are truly gone creates a situation they may never have prepared for. Because as long as there was a possibility that you would return, the relationship was not completely lost in their mind. There was still a thread connecting them to you. There was still the belief that the story was unfinished. But when that possibility disappears, when they understand that your decision is not temporary, something inside the dynamic changes completely. They are no longer dealing with a person who is upset. They are dealing with a person who has detached. And emotional detachment is often much harder to accept than anger. Anger still carries emotion. Anger still says, you affected me. Anger still leaves room for a reaction, an explanation, an apology, or another attempt to regain influence. But when someone reaches the point where they no longer need an answer, no longer need validation, and no longer need the other person to understand their pain, the entire balance of power shifts. This is why some people become especially unsettled when the person they lost begins healing. Not because healing is an attack, not because moving forward is revenge, but because genuine healing removes the emotional access they once had. The person who used to analyze every word, every mood, every change in behavior is no longer spending their energy trying to decode them. The person who used to ask, how can I make this work, begins asking, why did I accept so little for so long? And that question changes everything, because once someone begins seeing the relationship from a place of clarity instead of attachment, they often notice patterns they could not see before. They remember the moments when their feelings were dismissed. They remember the promises that were made but never followed by action. They remember how often they were asked to understand the other person while their own emotions were minimized. And this creates a painful reality for the person who lost them. The old version of you, the version who kept trying, is gone. They are not dealing with the same person anymore. They are dealing with someone who has learned from the experience. This is why some people attempt to recreate the old connection. They may reach out with a casual message. They may suddenly become nostalgic. They may bring up memories that were meaningful. They may say things like, I was thinking about the good times, or I miss what we had. Sometimes these moments are genuine expressions of emotion. Human beings can miss people. Human beings can feel regret. Human beings can recognize value after loss. But missing someone and being capable of maintaining a healthy relationship with them are two completely different things. A person can miss the comfort you provided while still not understanding the pain they caused. They can miss your loyalty while still avoiding accountability. They can miss the way you made them feel without truly understanding who you were and what you needed. This distinction is incredibly important because many people get trapped by the idea that someone's longing automatically means they have changed. But emotions alone do not create transformation. Awareness does. Responsibility does. Consistent behavior does. Real change is not proven by powerful words during a moment of fear. It is proven by patterns over time, and this is where many unhealthy dynamics repeat themselves. A person may feel the pain of losing someone and confuse that pain with personal growth. They may think, because I miss them, I must have changed. But missing someone only tells you that their absence affects you. It does not automatically tell you that you understand why they left. It does not automatically tell you that you are ready to create something healthier. The difference between regret and accountability is enormous. Regret says, I hate that this happened. Accountability says, I understand my choices contributed to this happening, and I need to change. One focuses on the pain of the loss. The other focuses on the responsibility behind the loss. And for someone with strong narcissistic defenses, accountability can feel extremely uncomfortable because it requires facing parts of themselves they have spent years avoiding. It requires accepting that the person who left was not simply cruel, difficult, or ungrateful. It requires accepting that the person who left may have been responding to a repeated pattern. This is where another behavior often appears. They may begin creating a new image of themselves. Suddenly they appear more reflective. They may talk about growth. They may share messages about healing, self-improvement, and emotional awareness. From the outside, it can look like the transformation you always hoped for finally arrived. And that can be one of the most confusing experiences for someone who has walked away, because a painful thought often appears. Why did they become this person after I left? Why couldn't they do this when I was still there? This question hurts because it feels unfair. You spent years asking for basic understanding. You explained your feelings. You communicated your needs. You hoped for change. And then after you leave, suddenly they seem interested in becoming better. But appearances can be complicated. A person can learn the language of growth without doing the deeper work of growth. They can talk about healing without confronting the wounds that create unhealthy behavior. They can understand psychological concepts without applying them to themselves. They can know what accountability sounds like without practicing accountability. This is why true transformation is usually quiet. It does not need constant proof. It does not need an audience. It does not depend on someone else noticing. Real growth changes how a person treats people when there is nothing to gain. It changes how they respond when they are criticized. It changes how they handle being wrong. It changes how they repair damage instead of simply explaining why they caused it. Because transformation is not about creating a better image. It is about becoming a different person internally. And that is the challenge many people face after losing someone valuable. They may want the reward of change without experiencing the discomfort of change. They may want forgiveness without accountability. They may want access to you without becoming someone safe enough to deserve that access. This is why your absence becomes so powerful. Your absence removes the opportunity to rely on the old pattern. They can no longer convince you with temporary improvements. They can no longer calm the situation with promises. They can no longer assume you will always be available. Now they are left alone with the consequences of the relationship they helped create. And that is often the moment when they begin to understand something they never expected. The hardest person to lose is not always the person who loved them the most. Sometimes it is the person who finally learned how to live without them. One of the most revealing moments after someone realizes you will never return is what happens when they begin comparing the reality of their life without you to the fantasy they created about life without you. Before you left, they may have imagined freedom. They may have imagined that everything would become easier. They may have believed that the problems in the relationship existed because of you, because of your expectations, because of your questions, because you wanted more than they were willing to give. They may have told themselves that once you were gone, they would finally feel peaceful. But then something unexpected happens. Life continues. And they begin discovering that removing one person does not automatically remove the patterns that existed inside them. Because the relationship was never only about you, it was also about the way they connected, communicated, handled conflict, accepted responsibility, and responded to vulnerability. A person can change partners, locations, routines, and circumstances, but if they never examine the patterns they carry inside themselves, the same difficulties often appear again. This is one of the hardest truths for someone who relies on external explanations. The problem is easier to blame on a person who is gone than to confront the parts of themselves that continue creating the same outcomes. And this is where the memory of you can become complicated. They may remember certain moments with unusual intensity. They may remember your kindness. They may remember how deeply you cared. They may remember the patience you showed when others would have walked away much earlier. But instead of allowing those memories to create genuine self-reflection, they may try to fit those memories into a story that protects their identity. They may think, you were special, but the timing was wrong. You were different, but the relationship was impossible. You cared about me, but you also had problems. Notice what happens in these explanations. There may be pieces of truth mixed with avoidance. Healthy reflection allows a person to hold multiple realities at the same time. A healthy person can say, that person had flaws and I also hurt them. The relationship had beautiful moments and I also contributed to its destruction. I lost someone valuable and I need to understand why. But when someone struggles with emotional maturity, complexity can feel unbearable. Everything must become simple. Someone must be right. Someone must be wrong. Someone must be the victim. Someone must be the cause. This black and white thinking protects the ego because it removes the uncomfortable middle ground where accountability lives. And that middle ground is exactly where growth happens. Because growth requires a person to sit with contradictions. It requires saying, I was hurt, but I also hurt someone. I had needs, but so did the other person. I felt misunderstood, but I may have also failed to understand. Without this ability, a person remains trapped in the same emotional cycle. They do not learn from the ending. They only search for ways to explain it. And this is why some people continue thinking about someone they lost for years. Not always because they are ready to love that person differently. Sometimes because that person represents a version of themselves they cannot escape. You become a reminder of the time someone believed in them, a reminder of the chances they received, a reminder of the person they could have become if they had faced themselves honestly. This can create a strange emotional contradiction. They may want to know how you are doing, but they may also struggle when they see that you are doing well. They may say they hope you are happy, but your happiness may challenge the story they created. Because if you are peaceful without them, then they must confront something painful. Maybe you did not leave because you were weak. Maybe you left because you became strong. Maybe your life did not collapse without them. Maybe your life finally began to expand. This is why some people become fascinated by the lives of those who leave them. They may look for updates. They may wonder what you are doing. They may compare your progress with theirs. They may ask mutual friends about you. Not every person who checks on an ex-partner is acting with harmful intentions. Curiosity after a meaningful relationship is human. But when someone is unable to accept emotional separation, checking can become a way of maintaining a psychological connection that no longer exists in reality. The relationship has ended externally, but internally they are still trying to keep a place for themselves in your world. They may wonder, do they still think about me? Do they miss me? Do they regret leaving? These questions reveal something important. They are no longer only focused on the relationship. They are focused on their significance within your story. And that distinction matters because healthy love asks, are you okay? Unhealthy attachment often asks, do I still matter to you? One is centered on care. The other is centered on validation. This is also why your silence can become so powerful. Silence forces people to sit with unanswered questions. When you constantly explain yourself, they can debate. When you constantly defend your choices, they can challenge. When you constantly seek understanding, they can keep the conversation alive. But when you stop participating, they lose access to the familiar pattern. They can no longer pull you into endless explanations. They can no longer rely on your emotional availability. They can no longer measure their importance through your reactions. And that is often when they notice the greatest change, not in what you say, in what you no longer do. You no longer chase. You no longer convince. You no longer ask for permission to have feelings. You no longer need them to agree with your decision in order for your decision to be valid. This is the transformation that can be most difficult for someone to accept, because the person they are trying to understand is no longer the person they remember. The old version of you was connected to the relationship. The new version of you is connected to yourself. And that is why losing you can become such a significant psychological event. They are not only losing a person, they are losing the role that person played. The emotional support, the attention, the constant reassurance, the person who believed there was something worth saving. And when that disappears, they are left with a question they may have avoided for a very long time. What happens when the person who always saw my potential finally stops waiting for me to become it? That question is not answered through appearances. It is not answered through temporary gestures. It is answered through deep self-awareness. Because the greatest loss is not losing someone who loved you. The greatest loss is losing someone who loved you, learning from the pain, and becoming someone who no longer needs to return. There is a final stage that reveals the deepest truth about what happens when someone realizes you are never coming back. It is not the moment when they remember the relationship. It is not the moment when they miss the comfort you provided. It is not even the moment when they recognize that your absence has changed their life. The most important moment comes when they are forced to confront a reality that cannot be avoided forever. You have become someone they can no longer define. For a long time, some relationships exist around a particular emotional pattern. One person reaches, explains, forgives, waits, and hopes. The other person responds from a place of defense, control, distance, or avoidance. The pattern continues because both people are participating in it. But when one person finally steps out of that pattern, the entire system changes. The old reactions no longer work. The old words no longer create the same response. The old methods of reconnecting no longer open the same door. And this can be deeply confusing for someone who was comfortable with the previous dynamic, because they are not only losing a person, they are losing a predictable source of emotional connection. They may have become accustomed to knowing that no matter what happened, you would eventually return to the conversation. They may have believed that conflict always ended with you trying harder. They may have assumed that your love was unlimited, but healthy boundaries reveal something important. Love can exist alongside distance. Care can exist alongside separation. Forgiveness can exist without returning. And this is a lesson many people struggle to understand. They confuse someone's kindness with permanent availability. They confuse someone's patience with acceptance of anything. They confuse someone's loyalty with a promise to remain regardless of how they are treated. But eventually, many people reach a point where love for another person is no longer stronger than love for themselves. That moment changes everything. Because when someone leaves from a place of clarity, they are not simply running away. They are choosing something. They are choosing peace over chaos. They are choosing dignity over endless explanations. They are choosing reality over potential. And that choice can be difficult for the person left behind, because it removes the fantasy that one more conversation, one more promise, or one more emotional moment will restore everything. Sometimes the hardest person to lose is the person who finally stopped trying to be chosen, because that person has already chosen themselves. And once someone reaches that point, they become much harder to pull back into the old cycle. This is why some people attempt different approaches after realizing you are truly gone. Some may try kindness, some may try nostalgia. Some may try appearing changed, some may try creating jealousy, some may try making you question whether leaving was the right decision. But all of these approaches have one thing in common. They are attempts to reopen a connection that has already changed internally. Because the real shift did not happen when you walked away. The real shift happened when you stopped needing them to understand why. That is the moment you became free. When your healing no longer depends on their apology. When your confidence no longer depends on their recognition. When your future no longer depends on whether they finally become the person you hoped they would be. That is when their opinion loses its power. And ironically, that is often when they may notice you the most, because people often recognize the value of something when they no longer have access to it. But your goal is not to become valuable because someone finally sees you. Your value existed before they recognized it. Your worth was never created by their attention. Your importance was never determined by their ability to appreciate you. The greatest victory after a painful relationship is not proving that someone regrets losing you. The greatest victory is reaching a place where whether they regret it or not no longer controls your peace. Because focusing endlessly on whether they miss you can become another way of remaining connected to them. True freedom is not needing evidence that you mattered. True freedom is knowing that you mattered, even if someone failed to treat you that way. And this is the lesson hidden inside every ending. Sometimes people lose access to someone not because that person stopped caring, but because they finally started caring about themselves. Sometimes the person who leaves is not the person who gave up. Sometimes they are the person who finally woke up. They woke up to the reality that love should not require constant self-abandonment. They woke up to the understanding that potential is not the same as progress. They woke up to the truth that someone's promises cannot replace someone's patterns. And once that awakening happens, there is no going back to the same version of yourself. The person who was willing to accept less has changed. The person who was afraid of losing someone has learned they can survive loss. The person who once searched for answers from another person has learned to trust their own experience. And that is why the narcissist, or anyone who struggles with losing control in relationships, may find your absence so difficult to understand, because they are not only facing the loss of your presence, they are facing the loss of the version of you that existed before your transformation. They may remember the person who stayed. They may remember the person who explained. They may remember the person who hoped, but they no longer have access to that person. Because that person was created by the old dynamic. The new you exists outside of it. And perhaps the most powerful thing you can do after leaving a relationship that diminished you is not to prove anything, not to make them jealous, not to show them what they lost, not to wait for the moment they finally understand. The most powerful thing you can do is quietly build a life that feels so aligned, so peaceful, and so authentic that their recognition becomes unnecessary. Because the final chapter is not about whether they come back. It is about whether you would even recognize the life you once begged for if you were still trapped in the same cycle. The person who truly heals does not need the past to apologize before moving forward. They do not need someone else to admit their mistake before trusting their own experience. They do not need to be remembered as the one who got away. They become the person who finally came home to themselves. And when that happens, something changes that no message, no apology, no performance, and no attempt to reconnect can reverse. The door is no longer closed because someone locked it. The door is closed because the person standing on the other side finally discovered they were never meant to stay there.